Welcome to the Museum of Everyone's Pride of Everyone series. The Museum of Everyone is an inclusive portable platform for artists and creatives that aims to amplify a diverse range of voices and perspectives through both artistic and community-led collaborative initiatives. The Museum of Everyone is a space for potential, collaboration, original thinking and action. Our ethos is simple. If you support your community in return will support you. To celebrate Pride Month, we aim to give voice to the minority groups within Ireland's queer community. With our esteemed guests, we will highlight ways in which the community compounds stigma and exclusion, but we will also explore ways to create a more inclusive and supportive community so that we really can have a pride of everyone. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 4, the final episode of the Pride of Everyone series with the Museum of Everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about sexuality and more specifically the kind of sexualities within the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, but really the ones that sometimes we pay lip service to and sometimes we don't include at all. So, you know, within the queer community, we talk about inclusion, but, you know, sometimes that's quite superficial and, you know, adding a couple of extra letters to the LGBT acronym doesn't always serve that purpose. So we're going to kind of come back to the kind of basics of what are the identities within the kind of queer community that we aren't necessarily familiar with. So we have 3 fantastic speakers again tonight. So we have Reid, whose pronouns are they, them. We have Rachel Whitbeck, whose pronouns are she, her, and Jess Kavanagh, whose pronouns are also she, her. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Ellen. So Ellen Reid is a third-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology. Their PhD research explores how individuals who identify as with bisexualities negotiate their sexual identities in everyday contexts in post-marriage equality Ireland. Outside of academia, they have been working on publications with Quare Media and Small Trans Library Dublin, and working with queer and trans community groups around Ireland. They are also a collage artist and zine maker, most recently editing Quaranzine in aid of MASI with artist producer Mankyy and for the Feminist Supermarket at Ormston House, Limerick. Sorry, I should have probably read that a few times. Anyway, Ellen, hi, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. So yeah, you identify as bisexual. And do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about your research, but also maybe if you can explain to some of our viewers who aren't kind of familiar with bisexuality and maybe some of the other sexualities that kind of come along or, you know, that are closely tied to that.
Yeah, sure. So basically my research kind of came out of this idea of marriage equality and how important that was for people who identify with bisexualities in Ireland. I kind of came to it in this position where I only came out after marriage equality, but I also came out at a time where I knew I was leaving Limerick and I knew I was moving away. And I felt that moving away from like university, moving away from people I went to school with, that this was actually enabling me to live a queer life that I couldn't here. So then I also kind of thought about this idea of this kind of watershed moment in Irish LGBTI plus history, where we finally became that nation of equals that, you know, was said in all the speeches when the vote came through. And I kind of thought about this in a way of saying, well, what is left for bisexualities? I feel like that wasn't addressed within this debate, within this referendum, where we kind of at a point where the needs, desires, wishes of bisexual people in Ireland haven't really been heard or may not be realised. So I kind of thought about this as someone who identifies as bisexual, but I've started thinking internally about calling myself a backslash bisexual. So I identify as bisexual / queer. So I'm thinking about that as potentially my kind of identity under that, because I don't want to think about it in the singular, that it is actually bisexualities. And a lot of people, academics particularly, talk about like plurisexualities and about thinking about those things like in the plural sense, I guess, because that bi prefix is always the problem, you know. So this is, I guess, where people kind of come into runs with bisexuality versus pansexuality, where bi is often considered like to be transphobic because it means that you just like two genders, where in actual fact, bi always meant more than one gender, the attraction is to, whereas pansexuality then is like gender doesn't kind of figure into the equation at all. Attraction is regardless of gender. So it's kind of this interesting thing where people that I've interviewed in the research like call themselves like bi/pan, or they would just refer to themselves as pansexual. And a lot of people have also spoken about how they feel that when they say that they're bisexual, they are worried about that because of the stigma that comes with it. Saying, you know, I don't want people to think I'm transphobic. I don't want people to think that I'm, you know, greedy. I don't want people to think that, you know, I am really promiscuous and I'm going to cheat on someone. This kind of rhetoric is always kind of doled out. So a lot of my research then was about trying to give voice to communities of bisexualities. And it's been really interesting. It's been really rewarding work. It's actually really nice to feel like there's a community out there, particularly when it is quite disconnected. You know, there isn't really, you know, bisexual spaces, as it were, as Claire Hemmings would say, there's no such thing as a bisexual space. But it was really nice to talk to people, but it was also very, very emotional to hear how people had these experiences of exclusion within the community. And one participant in particular said, you know, in LGBT spaces is where I learned how to not say I'm bisexual. So I think that there's still a long way to go with kind of like where we're at the moment. But I think it's all kind of this process of unlearning about those kind of stereotypes that we have, and this kind of necessity to put a border around certain sexual identities and kind of, you know, have these kind of labels of like, well, being a bisexual means you're X, Y, and Z, in the same way that I think Rachel and Jess can probably speak to people who are ace and people who are polyamorous, that there is certain ideas around different, you know, identity labels that kind of discredit you from participation in a wider group, whether that means you're not queer enough or too queer. It's kind of like towing that kind of tense line all the time. Yeah.
It's funny because, I mean, bisexuality was one of the third kind of sexualities to fall within the kind of LGBT spectrum, you know. So it's one of the kind of sexualities that has been recognized in name by the community, but very often tends to kind of be from you know, from what I've seen sometimes, say on dating apps and stuff, you know, the people are very kind of wary about dating bisexual women, certainly in lesbian terms, and you know, that it can sometimes be kind of sitting on the fence, or, you know, kind of exploring sexuality and stuff, you know. And I think it's amazing how in 50 years of modern LGBT activism, that this is still something that comes up within the community continuously. So I might just introduce our next speaker, Rachel Whitbeck. So Rachel is an asexual and aromantic, a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Limerick. Her research focuses on the experiences of LGBTQIA plus people in Ireland who also identify as belonging to a minority faith, race, or ethnicity. Outside of her research, Rachel coordinates the Gender, Culture and Society Postgraduate Forum and the Queer Reading Group, both at UL. So hi, Rachel, and again, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
So yeah, your research sounds fascinating, and particularly bringing in faith and ethnicity. And last week we were talking about ethnicity, and again, it's one of the underrepresented kind of minorities within the queer spectrum, but certainly kind of asexuality and people who kind of identify as aromantic. There's sexualities that aren't kind of always featured within the queer spectrum or aren't always visible. So maybe, do you want to maybe tell us a bit again about your research and a bit about those identities?
Sure. So they're kind of slightly separate things. So I'll start with the research. So as you noted, my research focuses on the experiences of LGBTQIA plus people who are also minority faiths, races, or ethnicities. And I started my research in the first phase talking to leaders within LGBTQIA plus organizations to ask them about their views on these double minority people, how they aim to include them, what kind of outreach they do. And then I'm currently in my second phase of the research where I talk to LGBTQIA plus people who are also these minorities to discuss their experiences just in general, but also with LGBTQIA plus organizations, groups, communities, spaces. And it's interesting. I'm only about 7 interviews into that particular phase. I've only interviewed one asexual person, but there is a clear divide between people who choose new religions versus ones who continue to follow the religions of their families, and how faith, or not faith rather, but race and ethnicity are fetishized or excluded, and how these minorities might be represented or might be spoken about, given lip service, but you'll never really see them in the leadership of LGBT organizations in Ireland, and why that might be. But in terms of my own experience, so yes, as you said, I'm asexual and aromantic, and those two are separate things. So I'll start with the asexuality. So it's sort of like Ellen was saying with bisexualities. It's more correct to say asexualities because there are a lot of different ways to experience this. But the general idea is that an asexual person does not feel sexual attraction. So it's something like a person at a banquet who isn't hungry. So you'll have some people who are asexual who are repulsed by the idea of sex and don't engage in sex. And you'll have asexual people who enjoy sex, but they just don't experience sexual attraction. But if they have a partner, they'll happily partake. So there are a lot of different experiences there. And it also comes into, it's a bit of a spectrum as well. So you have asexuality where you don't experience that sexual attraction. There's gray ace, so people who very rarely in their lives experience sexual attraction. So maybe with 1 or 2 people, or maybe in a few situations. And there's demisexuality, where you only experience sexual attraction after you've established a deep emotional connection. And there are all sorts of things in between. And aromantic is just kind of the romantic side of that. Not all asexual people are aromantic, and not all aromantic people are asexual. So aromantic people just don't have romantic inclinations and don't seek romantic relationships and have that same range that you would see in asexuality.
Yeah. Again, it speaks to a lot of what we've been coming across through these conversations, is just the diversity within all kind of experiences, and to be mindful of individual experiences, individual identities, and the way we kind of experience the world. And you know, what one person experiences is very different to another. So yeah, I'm going to just introduce Jess, and we'll kind of come back to some of these topics in the group discussion. So Jess Kavanagh is a singer-songwriter, a writer, poet, and a vocalist. She has been a key figure in creative communities in Ireland and abroad, and a prominent fixture in the Irish music scene. Raised by an Irish-Nigerian mother, she has spoken and written extensively about women's rights, mother and baby homes, and the invisibility of older generation mixed race Irish. She has also written and spoken publicly about her experiences in support of polyamory. And I suppose really that's kind of what we're talking about here tonight. So I know some of you may know Jess from Tommy Tiernan, and she's also written for the Irish Times and other kind of you know, public platforms. So maybe Jess, do you want to kind of tell us a bit about your experience with polyamory and how you kind of came to it and where it's brought you to?
Absolutely. I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me on today.
And I should have said thank you for being here. I thanked Ellen and Rachel. I'm sorry.
It's really beautiful to share the space with all of you and just to hear your story and your work. It's really, really amazing. So with me, I was thinking about this today. Interestingly, I feel like I was talking to myself a little bit about compulsory heterosexuality and also compulsory monogamy, and I feel like for me the beginning of my kind of big work with myself in regards to my romantic and my sexual orientation was actually the relinquishing of compulsory monogamy first, and then through that I have been able to then navigate through my orientation sexually and romantically. But I've been in a relationship with my partner now for nearly 8 years, and about 2.5 years ago I suffered a lot of emotional distress, and it came to pass that I was looking for to open up our relationship, and that was a very, very difficult time for both of us. But through that, I was very lucky, and we were very lucky to have a counsellor who transitioned us quite healthily from monogamy into polyamory, a counsellor who was also a psychosexual counsellor and also a poly-friendly counsellor. So we were really, really, really blessed. Mm-hmm. And through that process, I've just learned so much about myself. And just to explain in regards to what polyamory is, for me, polyamory is a romantic orientation that exists within the kind of umbrella of ethical non-monogamy. And essentially, it is a relationship between two people on the spectrum of intimacy, where the relationship is based on the desires and needs of those two particular people and not necessarily based on any predetermined templates that society have given us. And obviously with polyamory, you can have multiple partners, and then there is a complexity and nuance then depending on how many partners that you have, what kind of obligations and what kind of attachments that you have within those particular partners. And I guess personally for me, what I have found, and obviously, you know, it's been quite difficult because I've been polyamorous, I'd say, and practicing polyamory for about 2.5 years. But of course, we've been in lockdown for 18 months. So, you know, there hasn't been a huge amount of practicing over the last 18 months, but it has given me time for a lot of reflection, which I'm really grateful for. But through this process, I've noticed that the spectrum of romance and intimacy also applies to my friendships. And it also applies to so many of the different relationships that I have in my life. And what that has done is that it has allowed a lot more romance in my platonic friendships. It's allowed a lot of more self-romance. It's allowed me to have a better understanding of listening and also not projecting so much of my particular validation onto the relationships that I have with my life. And ability to do that work has been really, really amazing for me and for the other people in my life. Yeah,
it's great because the first time I came across Ellen's work was through the Queer Hedge School run by the Gay Project down in Cork. And one of the things with the Queer Hedge School was really trying to expand the notions of queer as a kind of a general concept, and kind of trying to return to that idea of expanding our relationships and what in society what we actually see as being kind of normative relationships, and accepting and understanding that, you know, monogamy in this instance is not necessarily what's right for a lot of people, but it's not necessarily what's wrong, you know, that it works both ways. And then there's also a lot of people who will fit into kind of within within polyamory and kind of fitting between that will have, you know, troubles and will quite happily cohabit as much as actually experience multiple relationships. So just, I suppose, within the idea of kind of queer as an umbrella term, you know, do you feel, Jess, that polyamory kind of fits within the queer spectrum? And I suppose it's also important to recognize that, you know, not everybody, or that, you know, polyamory works both for people who identify as heterosexual as much as for people who identify as within the kind of queer spectrum. But do you think that that the kind of umbrella term of queer fits the needs of kind of polyamorous identity? Or
I think that it overlaps. I think potentially is the better way of looking at it. You don't necessarily have to be queer to be polyamorous. I personally have found a lot more safety within queer spaces and being polyamorous. I think any particular space that doesn't adhere to, you know, mononormative or heteronormative spaces tends to be more inviting, saying that there's still, you know, a lot of work in regards to people kind of understanding what polyamory is. But also, you know, there is a lot of healthy non-monogamy within queer spaces already, and it may not necessarily be under the polyamorous umbrella, but generally under the ethically non-monogamous umbrella. So there's overlaps and there's definitely intersections for sure. But it's not necessarily always going to be in the queer space, if that makes sense. Yeah. But I certainly feel more comfortable within those spaces for sure.
And Ellen, in terms of your research, you know, do you think that the kind of the queer community has a good understanding of kind of, you know, the non-lesbian gay sexualities, so the kind of wider sexualities?
Okay, so in my research, I make a very clear point to like separate queer from LGBT plus, and that's only like for personal reasons, because I think that it's quite a political history. Has a political legacy.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about it, I guess, in like a general, like wider LGBT and queer communities together, I think that it depends on, I think it depends on the individual who you're coming into contact with. And I think this was what I found really in my research, was like a lot of people had really positive experiences, were invited to, you know, speak at events, were told that they should come back to events that they had left because they were in a straight passing relationship, and said, no, this is still your space. But then on the other side, there was people who were like, had really, really horrible experiences. But I think it differs from person to person. So I don't think we can really make very much like sweeping statements about the community. Although I know in the past myself, I have felt like I have made statements like that because I've been in quite hurtful situations where I've been in queer spaces and felt like I wasn't being validated and things like that. But I think what was a really interesting thing that came up in my research was, particularly because the majority of the people that I interviewed were cis women, it was their closeness to heterosexuality, their proximity to heterosexuality, that made them like unsafe. And similar situations with the bisexual men who were in straight passing relationships or straight perceived relationships. If they were married, if they were in a relationship with a woman, they felt like they could no longer attend spaces. And it's this kind of it's the threat of heterosexuality, which I mean, like, I fully feel that, you know, like that's been a threat to the community, to the safety of the community for a really long time. But it's that idea that is specifically tied to gender, that when we see something and we automatically read that as something as heterosexual, when there may be a lot more nuances in it, that's where we come into problems, because then it ends up falling back into that problem of like, you don't tick all the boxes of what it means to be a queer person, which leads people then to feeling very insecure in themselves, questioning their identities. And a lot of the participants expressed that they often had like crises of sexuality, where they said like, oh, I miss being queer, so do I actually really love my partner? And this is kind of a thing then where you see people running into huge amounts of problems with mental health, you know, relationship issues and things like that, because they feel like they have lost something or they've been excluded for something. So I think it's a long way to go. It's very much like it's a case by case basis, but I think overall, the lack of acknowledgement of bisexualities as being a vibrant and viable, you know, group within the community, I don't think that has really happened yet in Ireland.
And Rachel, I know that you're from America, so you've only been here for is it 4 years? Did you say 5? Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of your experience within the queer community, do you feel that asexuality is recognized by the queer community, both in Ireland and in America, or how does that differ, or does it?
Well, it doesn't differ that much, interestingly, at least not in my experience. So this is not something I've done research on. I can only speak from personal experience here.
Yeah.
But asexuality is something that's increasingly being mentioned. It's increasingly being like, you know, part of the list. But I can say that in the United States and then here now, I've not felt necessarily not unwelcome. I've never felt invited to LGBTQ plus spaces. There's not a lot of outreach that I've seen done. There's not a lot of saying you're welcome here. This space is for you. And so there are other spaces. There's Ireland Asexuality. There's AVEN, which is an international website. But in LGBTQ plus spaces, there's often this feeling that you're not queer enough to really warrant your presence. But I've never had anyone say anything to me. But that's also, I haven't really been in those spaces very often, because it just doesn't feel like it's for me, even though I very much feel like I'm part of the LGBTQIA plus community.
Yeah. And would you say your experience within kind of wider society or kind of heteronormative society has been more positive, or?
Well, no. So I feel like I'm kind of just stealthing all over the place. So
yeah.
The way that I look, having short hair, facial piercings, tattoos, and I usually dye my hair fun colors, but it's been a pandemic, so this is just my natural color. I look queer, so I'm often read that way by people, and the assumption is generally that I'm a lesbian. And that's never really been an issue, because I don't know why. I've just been lucky, I guess. But in more heteronormative spaces, there tends to be more questions of, do you have a partner? Why don't you have a partner? When are you going to get a partner? But of course, I'm not saying partner, because that would be too aggressive, too inclusive. So it's often felt like there's not really a space, and often felt like there's this strange internalization that I hope is not common to all asexual people, but a questioning of, do I even deserve a space? Because I don't even have a sexuality, so why do I need one? And of course, I know that that's not a fair thought, but that's been sort of an experience for me.
Well, I suppose it kind of, what speaking to what Ellen was saying about the term queer, and that it has a lot of kind of political connotations and stuff like that. I suppose more often it is understood as a kind of an umbrella term. And do you feel that kind of fitting within that umbrella can create more inclusion, or do you think it's better to have to retain those individual identities?
I think there should be both. So using queer as an umbrella term, which I, like Ellen, tend to use it slightly differently, but using it as an umbrella term, I think having asexuality in there, I think it can feel very inclusive. It's very welcoming, because queer spaces and ideas are about challenging heteronormativity and the expectations of what your life should look like with sexual and romantic partners. And so LGBTQIA places feel very often like a very natural fit for asexual people, even if they don't necessarily feel like they've been invited. But I also know that there are other asexual people who don't feel a need to be part of the LGBTQIA plus community, that don't feel any need to engage, and that's also perfectly valid. And some people want their own individual spaces to just discuss like being ace, and that's fine too. I think there can be all sorts of different levels of spaces. But I do think that a recognition that asexuality is a challenging of heteronormativity, and therefore belongs in queer spaces, it would be beneficial.
And Ellen, sorry, going back to you there about the like, what do you think that the impacts of that kind of invisibility of identity can, like, do you find that not having that recognition of or that dismissal of kind of bisexuality as being valid, what have you come across the kind of repercussions of that? You talked about mental health, I think.
Yeah, I think just a lot of people feel really insecure in themselves. I know, like, a lot of people have said to me, I don't really know if this is the right thing for me. And actually the huge thing that people said was, I wish that I knew about this when I was younger, which I think the whole Flourish program is now like that's the threat. We already have nothing, and now we're going to get something that is more but potentially worse. That people don't really come across these things until they're much later in life, and then it's kind of just sprung upon them. And I feel like that might be the same with Jess and Rachel, that like, it takes a lot of work to figure out like what you need in your life, and what actually suits you and what helps you grow as a person. So if you constantly feel like you are being pulled in different ways towards your attraction, and that idea of being, extending out into spaces where you have multiple attractions is fundamentally confusing and seen as potentially wrong or invalid in society, there is a certain pressure on yourself to feel like you need to pick one. I know that has been something that I felt really, really strongly, even in the very recent past, where I constantly reevaluate where I am and what I should be doing around my sexuality label. And I think that's the big thing, is that like, because a lot of people don't have knowledge about themselves, because they don't really have access or community or haven't felt a connection to people, that they then say, well, wouldn't it be just easier if I lived my life like this? And I think that's incredibly limiting, and it's incredibly sad to think, and it ties into what Jess was saying about compulsory heterosexuality, is that some people, because they felt like they've never actually gotten to explore their more queer side, even though that's really problematic to say that, but exploring queer relationships when they may have only been in quote unquote heterosexual relationships, they then feel like I could risk everything. And I feel like that's it. It feels like a big risk and a big loss all the time, when you feel like you don't know anything about yourself, because society continuously tells you you don't know anything about yourself, just pick one.
Well, I think one of the things we've kind of come up again, going back to the other talks that we've had, and it's just kind of talked again and again and again, really is about education. And both in a systematic format, in an institutional format, but also just in terms of on a personal level, in actually kind of understanding and learning about other experiences and hearing the voice, hearing voices from other people. And certainly I know, growing up as a butch tomboy, I didn't ever see myself in anybody else, and that was really, and I still now 40 years on, I'm kind of constantly questioning that. So I think, in terms of that, Jess, for you with polyamory, and I know you said that you went through a very supportive counseling kind of experience with your partner. Do you think, and looking at the kind of school's curriculum, Alan, you mentioned Flourish. That's kind of the new program that they're, yeah. So, I mean, do you think polyamory is, if you had learned about it in school, is it something that you would have, like, sorry, I'm not articulating this very well, but do you think that going through the practice of monogamy has helped you to accept polyamory in your life, or do you think it would have been more useful to just have understood it from the beginning?
I think once again, it's going back to this idea of showing people a reality and saying this is how the world works. Everybody, a man loves a woman, and then they get together and they stay together forever. The end. And like, thank you, Disney, loved it. But if I would have loved to have known that there was other ways to live my life, and I'm very lucky. Like my best friend is a non-binary queer person, and they lived in Edinburgh, and I remember going over to visit them back in 2010, and it was the first time that I was introduced to gender queer, just before kind of, I guess, Twitter took off and non-binary then became a more accepted term. And so, like, it was the first time I was introduced to non-monogamy. It was the first time I was introduced to gender queer, and I was in college studying English Media and Cultural Studies, and it was the first time I'd read Judith Butler, and it was a very exciting time. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what I want. And I knew in my heart, the idea of being able to love more than one person felt absolutely right for me when I was growing up and people, talked about monogamy and being with one person for the rest of your life, and only being sexually and romantically attracted to one person for the rest of your life. It made me feel uncomfortable. It made me feel panicked. And of course, like any non-normative orientation, it would become associated then with my trauma, that the reason why you feel this way is because you've been traumatized. Whereas actually what I found is the more I have become in tune with my own sexual orientation and my own romantic orientation, it has allowed me to process my trauma healthily, the other way around for me. And I'm sure for a lot of people, but I absolutely would have loved to have known that. But I remember in my heart feeling like that's what I wanted, but thinking there's no way there's going to be an environment available for me to practice that. And to an extent, like, it does take a village, because it takes my friends to accept the fact that when I come to them in tears because I've broken up with somebody, and I'm not talking about my nesting partner or my life partner, that they understand that I'm still heartbroken. And at the beginning of that process, I think that it took my close friends some time. It took other friends some time to see me out with my other partners being, giving personal displays of affection. That was difficult for my friends, knowing that they know my primary partner. I try not to use hierarchical terms, but my nesting partner. And so it does take a community to change in order to feel accepted. And I totally identify with what Ellen and Rachel are saying, and that proximity to heterosexuality has made me sometimes feel that I don't deserve to be in certain spaces, because I'm not enough on the periphery to feel like I should be allowed in these spaces. And it very much ties into my identity as a whole as well, being a light passing person of color. You know, that it's all of that hybridization within myself and all that the multiplicities and the nuances of my identity. But having these conversations and talking about spaces and exactly that idea of having a space for people with orientations where we can feel safe and we can discuss things, but also to widen that out into, you know, the wider LGBT QIA plus community as well, and to make sure that everybody feels inclusive. So it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of education, and it takes multiple amounts of communities, I think, to work.
Yeah. So I suppose that kind of goes to my next question in terms of how you feel that the community can become more inclusive and kind of supportive of you know, polyamorous.
Well, certainly as well, just to take into consideration what you initially said too about you know, what I felt different if I knew about it in school, is that, like, that's really important for kids who are potentially who have polyamorous parents, you know, or kids who you know, because they're going to be ostracized and they're going to be traumatized, you know, when they go to school and they talk lovingly about their parents, and other people don't understand, including the teachers, you know, and that also is inclusive of, you know, trans parents and gay parents and queer parents. You know, all of those kids need to be protected so they're not ostracized or bullied in school. So that information is important, you know, in all facets of our society, and that teachers and different educational communities understand that these families exist, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess for me, the important thing to remember when you are talking about these issues as well is, for me, and I don't know how Rachel and Ellen feel, but when we talk about these things, that it's not just about sex. And this is what I find with polyamory, is that people want the juicy details, or they think that it's about having the freedom to have sex with loads of people, and that's the reason why. And for me, it is that I have the capacity to love more than one person, and there's a deep need inside me to want to do that and to make those relationships. And sometimes, you know, a part of that, of course, is being able to connect with somebody on a romantic and sexual way. And a lot of the time it is emotional work, and a lot of the time it is Google Calendar, and it is admin, and it is making sure that you have enough time to spend time with other people. So it's having these discussions. It's not thinking that the drive for all of this is based on our sexual desires, and it's more complex, it's more nuanced, and it's something that's integral to our sense of self and to feel accepted. And I think when we talk about authentic humanity, what we want is to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be allowed to be our most authentic selves, and to allow people to do that. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100%. And Rachel, can I just ask you the same question in terms of, you know, how do you feel the community can be more kind of supportive and inclusive?
Well, I think Jess touched on something really important there about not addressing LGBTQIA plus identities as just being about sex, because when that's the framework, then where does asexuality go? Although actually it does even show up sometimes in discussions about asexuality. There's people almost kind of want to test you. It's like, well, have you had sex before? How many people have you had sex with? How do you know? And it's just like, it's none of your business. It's really none of your business. And I think that just in terms of the community, insofar as there's a single LGBTQIA plus community, but there's often been an emphasis on like club culture and bar culture and hookup culture, which is just not for me. And the hookup part is probably not for a lot of asexual people. And I think also just often including them and having them being part of discussions, and when you're talking about any particular topic, just include an asexual and or aromantic person to kind of give their perspective on how this this reflects on us. And I think including it in the education is so important, because I was 20 years old when I realized that I was probably not straight and I was calling myself bisexual. But then when I was in my mid-20s, I'm like, well, why have I not had sex then? Because I'm clearly pretty enough. So that's not the issue. And the answer was simply, I don't want to. That's why I haven't done it, because I haven't wanted to. Yeah. And then it took me, so that was when I was 25. It took me until I was 28 to think, why have I not had a romantic relationship? Clearly it's not because I don't have a winning personality. So why is that? It's because I don't want to. And it took me until just 2 months ago to find out that there was a specific micro-identity that validated my specific experience. And if I had just known all of this from the start, it wouldn't have been so confusing for me to think, I'm bisexual, but I don't feel like I'm part of the LGBTQIA+ community. I don't feel comfortable in these spaces. I don't feel invited. And like trying to do the whole dating thing, because like that's what you do. Mm-hmm. And taking into my mid-late 20s to realize that I don't want to. Yeah. And it shouldn't take that long to realize that you don't want to do something. So I think education is a huge part of it.
Absolutely. No, 100%. Yeah, if it's any consolation, it took me about 37 years to realize the term butch. And, again, Jess was talking about reading Judith Butler. For me, it was reading Jack Halberstam. But again, it's that thing of education and visibility. And Ellen, I suppose, same question to you. And yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, I think, because Lisa Duggan would always say, like, with every inclusion, there's always going to be an exclusion of someone else. So where do you get to the point where there is no longer any exclusion? Does that ever happen? And I kind of always then go back, sorry, I'm really big into queer theory, but I kind of always go back then to Jose Munoz of like, queerness is not yet here. And like the idea of cruising utopia, that like we always have to keep going because, as Rachel said, like, finding a specific micro identity that like resonates with you is incredibly important to acknowledge that. In the same way, Jess coming to polyamory was an incredibly important part of her life. And I think it is just about having difficult conversations. And, it is just about like letting people in and like learning to love each other. And I know that sounds really like facetious or like kind of cringy in a way, but I feel like there's so much kind of, it's kind of like the queer Olympics of like, who is the best possible queer, and trying to basically, I guess, discredit people's identities and say, well, this can't be queer, or this isn't part of the LGBT community. I think that happens with all of our identities here, that like, even butch identity is often, quite, discriminated against a lot of the time as well, that like, there ends up being this case of like, who is better than other people? And I was listening to a podcast with Tori Peters, and she was talking specifically about the trans community, with saying because of like the fallout of the AIDS crisis, that there is no kind of lineage of a queer and trans community. So we end up now comparing ourselves to the generations that we're at now, and basically saying, well, you're actually not a good reflection of this, so we don't want you in our space. So I think what always kind of makes me feel a little better is reminding myself that something almost always must ooze from the box, and that there's always going to be something that will fall out of a specific label. So while we might find comfort in specific labels and they can feel, like warm, cozy jumpers to ourselves, that we always need to be open to other people and like, being respectful to everyone, regardless of where they're coming from, what their identity is, and just saying like, you can be here as long as we kind of respect one another, and engaging in kind of a more coalitional politics rather than a, this is our camp, you stay away kind of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's kind of a good note to finish up. And I suppose, again, I want to thank you guys all for being here, and it really has been a fantastic conversation. But I also want to, just to finish up, given it's the last in the series, I want to just say thank you to all our viewers, and just to kind of share my own experiences from these conversations. And actually, Ellen's just it's almost as if she could read my notes, because, well, in the whole conversation, education was one of the points that I've picked up on, and just listening and including voices and hearing experiences and representation, but also then for us to have those difficult conversations, to learn from people's experiences and to bring them out to the wider community and to wider society. But also, I'm really heightenedly aware, and I've mentioned it in other topics, of the voices, and again, what Ellen's just said, the voices that we have excluded in this series, you know, and not just within each topic that we've talked about, and the other, you know, within the disabilities and the ethnicities and all of that we've excluded, as well as that we've excluded issues around class, issues around parenting within the queer community, issues around aging, issues around body image, and there's a whole myriad of conversations that need to be had, and that we all need to keep having with one another and with the community, and expanding and trying to create those inclusions. So, as I've said on other occasions, I don't intend for these to be the last of the conversations that we have. As the Museum of Everyone, we are committed to engaging with the community, with all types of communities, and we really want to try and bring these conversations forward. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being a part of this, and best of luck with everything, and we'll keep in touch. Okay.
Thank you so much.